Welcome to Thread of Terror. We bring you the creepiest stories from Reddit. Dim the lights, grab a blanket, and hit subscribe so you never miss a scare. People of Reddit, what's your paranormal ghost story? Story 1. House that refused to burn.
I've had a few strange things happen to me, but I will share one that started with my father and is still ongoing today. My father grew up in rural Wisconsin. We are talking about farms and forests stretching for hours before reaching a city back in the 1940s. When he was a boy, he and his brother would play in the countryside to their heart's content. One of their favorite places happened to be a nearby property that their family rented for the fields, as the home on it lay abandoned. And the home was unique. Built before the Great Depression, it featured a rare Southern-style architecture in a Norwegian-dominated area. It had a big open porch, 2 stories with a huge open stairwell, and a massive southern-facing bay window looking into the sitting room, which was to the left of the entryway. At the very bottom of the stairs there was a piano that had been broken in half by some previous person. One half remained in one of the 3 upstairs bedrooms. The other half sat at the bottom of the stairs. My father and my uncle, a few years apart in age, one just over 8 and the other 10, were playing in the bedrooms while my grandfather was in the nearby field preparing for the harvest. My father was at the beginning of the hall right at the top of the stairs, while my uncle was in the last bedroom at the end of the hall. All of a sudden the hair stood up on their arms and the backs of their necks. A violent, echoing laughter filled the house, and someone played a full scale on the piano. My father and uncle ran downstairs as fast as they could. My grandfather, hearing the laughter from the field, ran to the house and literally pulled them from the doorway as they struggled to get out. Later that night, my grandparents, father and uncle, returned to the house. My grandfather lit 2 Molotov cocktails, throwing one into the open doorway and smashing the other on the porch. The flames spread for a moment, then the same eerie laughter rang out, and the flames were extinguished as if by an unseen force. My family stopped renting that land. 40 years later, my father told me this story. My grandparents verified it. About 5 years after hearing this, my girlfriend and I were driving back from visiting family in the Northwoods. It was exceptionally late at night when we got a flat tire. I got out to change the tire, and my girlfriend stepped out as well. Living in Wisconsin, I always carried a safety kit in the car, including thermal blankets and a large flashlight. As she shined the light around, she said, "I see a house over there. Should we see if we can get help?" I looked up, following the beam from the flashlight, and my eyes landed on a rare Southern-style 2-story home with an open porch and a large bay window. It looked abandoned but was strangely untouched. The window was immaculate. A chill ran down my spine. I immediately told her to get back in the car and started rushing to change the tire. She could see the distressed look on my face and did not ask why. Just before she got into the car, a few lone piano chords played from inside the house. We drove nearly a mile away with only 3 bolts securing the spare tire before I pulled over again to finish the job. As far as I know, that house is still there, just off a main county road in the Northwoods of Wisconsin, waiting for someone to come and find out why that piano is still playing by itself.
Story 2. Demonic possession in church.
When I was younger, I saw what I believe was a demonic possession. More accurately, I saw someone who appeared to be possessed. I have talked and written about this before, but lately, I have felt the urge to share it again. I apologize in advance if there are any issues with my typing. I am on mobile. I was young at the time, though I cannot say exactly what age. My brother, who is 5 years older than me, was old enough to operate the soundboard at the church our family attended. This took place during a night service on a Sunday, around 6 p.m., in either late fall or early winter. I remember that when the service ended it was dark outside, but not the deep late-night darkness. The service ended at around 8 p.m. My brother and I were at the back of the room where services were held, near the soundboard. My grandfather, who was watching us, was also the pastor of the church. He was, and still is, a man of strong faith, deeply rooted in doctrine. Over the years, he has shared stories about demonic possessions, faith healing, and divine intervention. That night, he was at the back with us, making sure my brother understood how to operate the soundboard, while I tried to learn a thing or two myself. The large board of dials and levers looked almost magical to me. Then, a woman walked in. She was young, perhaps around 25, but she looked unwell. Her hair was disheveled, there were dark circles under her eyes, and she was unusually pale. However, she did not appear to be homeless. She was wearing nice clothes, heeled shoes, and some jewelry. I did not recall ever seeing her before. She quietly took a seat at the front of the room near the altar and pulpit. The service began with 10 minutes of hymns. As usual, the congregation sang from thick green hymn books that the church had about 100 copies of. The woman did not stand or participate, but she remained silent and did not cause any distractions. Then, my grandfather took to the pulpit to begin his sermon. I cannot remember what the sermon was about because my focus was on the woman. She had started rocking in her seat. It struck me as odd. Meanwhile, my brother was trying to get the recording hardware attached to the sound system to work. The issue was not that it would not record, but rather that when my brother inserted a disc to record, it broke in half. It had worked fine for the morning service, and none of the settings had been changed. The service continued, but the woman became more and more distracting. Eventually, the service ended, and my brother and I were escorted out. This was unusual, as people normally stayed to chat afterward, but not that night. I sat on the walkway outside the church with my brother and grandmother, while my grandfather and the church officers remained inside with the woman. From outside, I could hear Bible verses being recited, screaming, and the lights flickering through the windows. About 10 minutes later, they all came outside. The woman looked completely different. The dark circles under her eyes were gone. Her hair was still a mess, but now it looked shinier and healthier. She thanked my grandfather before getting into her car and leaving. I would fully believe this was just a case of someone struggling with mental illness, if not for the way the sound system malfunctioned, and how dramatically her appearance changed when it was all over. I still think about that night.
Story 3. A child's unsettling story.
This story did not happen to me, but to my cousins in South Carolina. Jesse, the youngest, had just turned 5. He was not born when Grandma Margie passed away nearly 10 years ago. There are only 1 or 2 pictures of her in their house, so that is the only way he knows what she looks like. To him, she is just Grandma Margie. His parents rarely talk about her. It has been so long since she was gone. One afternoon, Jesse was playing alone in the living room, talking quietly to himself. His other grandmother, curious, leaned in and asked, "Who are you talking to, Jesse?" Without hesitation, he looked up and answered, "Grandma Margie." His grandmother froze. "Grandma Margie?" Jesse nodded, smiling. "She is really nice. She likes to play with me." At first, they brushed it off. Kids have imaginary friends all the time, right? But over the next few days, Jesse kept mentioning her. "She talks to you?" they asked. "Yes," Jesse replied. "She plays with me. She is really nice. I like Grandma Margie." It was unsettling. There had never been any discussion about Grandma Margie, and Jesse was far too young to remember anything about her. A week later, while driving with his grandmother, she decided to ask casually, "Is Grandma Margie with you now?" Jesse, still looking out the car window, immediately shook his head. "No," he said. "She is up there in the sky." His voice was so certain, so matter-of-fact, that his grandmother felt a chill run down her spine. "Up in the sky," she whispered. Jessie nodded. "She is up there watching." From that day on, the family paid closer attention. Jessie still spoke about her from time to time, never scared, always sure of her presence. His parents never understood how he knew her name, her kindness, or why he was so certain that she was watching from above. Was it just a child's imagination? Or had Grandma Margie really come back to visit her grandson, someone she had never met in life? Even now, the family is waiting to hear more.
Story 4. Do not sleep in this house alone.
My husband's house has always been super creepy. When I moved in at 17, I did not believe things were as strange as his family made them out to be. But I was so wrong. His bedroom door lines up directly with the living room. If you were to sit in the middle of the living room with a flashlight, you could shine it right into his room where he would be sleeping. Well, I was the one in his room, in his bed, asleep, and he was on the couch, passed out. I woke up, eyes still closed, to the sound of someone hitting the armrest of the couch. It was a hollow but soft thud, a sound I could only mimic by tapping on the couch myself. Then, it looked like someone was turning a flashlight on and off right in front of my face. Still half asleep and annoyed by the light, I kept my eyes shut and called out, "Babe, what are you doing?" No response. My eyes shot open. There was no flashlight. The sound from the couch kept happening, but I could clearly see my husband was fast asleep. I pulled my feet up to my chest and scanned the dark room. "Babe," I yelled. He jolted awake, looking toward the kitchen, just as I heard one final loud bang. My husband jumped up, immediately asking me what was happening, how long I had been awake, and what was in the house. He told me he had assumed I was messing with him until he heard me yell. When he finally got up, he turned toward the kitchen, where all the cabinets were at various stages of being opened. Before either of us could react, they all slammed shut at once, followed by a loud bang against our back door. I never really believed in the paranormal before, but after that, I did not take any chances. I cleansed the entire house with sage and placed salt at every door and window. There was something in that house that night, and whatever it was, it did not want us there.
Story 5. Stalking in the woods.
I have lived in Kentucky my entire life. In late May or early June of 2017, I had just purchased my first AR-style rifle, a Ruger AR 556. My family owns over 20 acres of land, so I decided to sight in my rifle there instead of at a gun range. To reach the field, I had to cross a barbed wire fence and walk through 300 feet of dense woods. The moment I stepped over the fence, an unsettling feeling washed over me. I had been here countless times before, yet something was different that day. Something wanted me to leave. The deeper I went, the worse it became. It felt as if something unseen was watching me, studying me. Halfway through, the fear became unbearable. My instincts screamed at me to stop, so I listened. I loaded my magazine with 20 rounds, just in case. Then, without warning, the stench of decay filled the air. I turned around and saw a mangled carcass behind me, either a rabbit or a possum. The wounds looked fresh, but the smell was unbearable, far worse than its condition suggested. I pressed forward, nearly reaching the clearing when I heard it, a heavy splash in the creek beside me. I turned, and that was when I saw it. Standing at 8 to 9 feet tall, the creature loomed over the water. It had unnaturally long limbs, stretched skin clinging to its bones, and a light brown, almost greyish hue. It walked in an eerie, unnatural way, silent, despite its towering size. It never turned toward me, just kept moving. Panic set in. I tried chambering around, but my magazine jammed, refusing to feed the bullet. A terrifying realization struck me. If it had attacked, I would have been defenseless, but it did not. It walked away, disappearing into the trees. Afterward, I researched creatures that matched what I saw. The closest match, a Wendigo. What unsettled me most was the proximity of my home to a Trail of Tears site, only 2 miles away. Could this be connected? I still wonder why it let me go. I have never seen it again, but I will never forget that day.
Story 6. Entity taunts us.
This story is about an experience my aunt and uncle had in the mid-90s when they were newly married. They had just graduated from college and were looking for their first apartment together. On a tight budget, they found an affordable unit, although it was right next to an old cemetery. When they arrived for the viewing, the woman showing them the place mentioned that previous tenants had reported strange occurrences in the apartment, drawers opening and closing on their own, doors slamming shut, but she brushed it off, suggesting it was rare and probably nothing, if you believe in that sort of thing. Being devout Christians, they didn't think much of it and decided to move in, but shortly after settling in, the strange occurrences started happening. Items went missing, things were moved, and drawers opened and closed on their own. These events happened almost daily, but they tried to ignore them. It wasn't until the 3rd or 4th day that something happened which they couldn't explain. My aunt had just showered and climbed into bed next to her husband, who was reading the paper. Exhausted, she closed her eyes, hoping to relax before sleeping. Suddenly, she felt her husband turn toward her, but instead of speaking, he started giggling. He poked and prodded her, like a playful child, but with an unsettling intensity. His face looked strange, almost unrecognizable, and out of character. He then rolled off the bed, still giggling manically, and crawled under the bed, pushing up against the box spring as if taunting her. Fear took over, and my aunt called out to him in confusion, "What are you doing?" To her horror, she then heard his voice from the other room, asking, "What is it?" Terrified, she rushed out of the bedroom and found him in the living room, sitting casually, reading his paper. They immediately packed a few things and left for a hotel, never to return. They broke the lease and only returned to the apartment with family to pack up their belongings.
Story 7. Unseen Dweller.
When I was 13, my sister and I lived in the backwoods of Texas. Our land was surrounded by a dense forest, part of a national preserve, and the isolation was overwhelming. One day, my 8-year-old sister and I decided to take a walk in the woods, something we did frequently. The strange thing was, we always knew exactly where we were, no matter how far we walked. It was like we could sense the way back home. This time, we ventured deeper into the forest, past the makeshift fort we had built, and decided to explore. We weren't worried about the time, though we knew our mother would call us back before dark. We had been walking for about 30 minutes when something caught my attention. The sky seemed to grow darker than it should have been. At that moment, my sister tugged on my arm. Through the thick trees and underbrush, we saw what appeared to be a clearing. Curious, I led my sister towards it, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. When we entered the clearing, my heart dropped. In the middle of the open space stood a 2-story house, out of place amidst the wild forest. There were no roads leading to it, no paths, nothing that could explain its existence. The house was old but well maintained, and we were both filled with dread. As the wind picked up, we stared at the house, unable to tear our eyes away. Something felt off, like we weren't meant to see it. Then, I noticed a light flickering in the window on the 2nd floor. I was frozen as I watched a figure rock back and forth in the light, blocking it with each movement. My sister suddenly squeezed my hand so tightly that my fingers went numb. I looked down at her, but before I could say anything, she started crying. "It's waving," she whispered, her voice trembling. My heart skipped a beat. I looked up, and sure enough, I saw an arm waving at us, rocking back and forth in rhythm with the figure. It wasn't human. I could feel my pulse racing, and I grabbed my sister's hand, pulling her with me as we ran. We didn't stop until we reached the safety of our fort. When we got home, my mum dismissed the whole thing, but the memory of that house has never left me. Years later, when I asked my sister about it again, she described the scene in exact detail. We both remember it so vividly. Yet, when I went back to the woods, there was nothing. No house, just trees. To this day, I can't explain what we saw. All I know is that it wasn't a trick of the light or our imagination.
Story 8. Ouija board's deadly warning.
My older sister, who was in her mid to late 30s at the time, was experimenting with an Ouija board. Our family had a history of strange occurrences related to these boards, which is why I've always steered clear of them. I'm a firm skeptic. Maybe it was a coincidence, maybe my sister was playing a prank on me, or maybe something else happened. But I don't think she would lie about this. So the story goes like this. My sister and her friends were using the Ouija board when it spelled out a chilling message. It said that an entity, a person trapped in hell, needed their help to escape. The board spelled out a first and last name, and the words "Stop Jim Doe" or something similar, urging them to find this person and stop him. Once they finished using the board, my sister made a note of the name in the message. We've learned over the years to keep track of things like this. Fast forward a few days, I get a call from my sister, and she's in a full-blown panic. She says, "I swear I'm not making this up. I know you're the only one who won't think I'm crazy when I tell you this." She tells me the story about the Ouija board, the entity, and the name it spelled out. A few days later, while reading the newspaper, she comes across a small article about a tragic car accident. It was a family that had been killed in a crash involving a drunk driver. The accident was horrific. Everyone in the family died, husband, wife, children, and the drunk driver as well. And to her utter shock, the drunk driver's name was the exact same name the Ouija board had spelled out. My family has experienced other strange coincidences with the Ouija board. My mother had a similar experience when she was a teenager. She asked the board if she would ever get married, and it spelled out HG. When she asked about how many children she would have, it spelled out RMTA. At the time, she didn't think much of it, but years later, when she had us, it was eerily accurate. HG were the initials of my father, and RMTA were the first initials of each of her 4 children, in order of our births. I still chalk it up to strange coincidences, but every time I think about it, I can't shake the feeling that something far more sinister was at play. I can't help but wonder if the Ouija board opened something we were never meant to understand.
Story 9. A shadow that never left.
This happened when I was about 11 or 12, around 14 years ago. My family moved from a small town to a house on a hill in the city, supposedly a great deal. The day we moved in, the previous renters, a mother and her son who was close to my age, were just finishing up. I'll never forget the look on the mother's face as she left. Something about it was off. She looked unsettled, like she was trying to get away from something. A few weeks passed, and we settled in. The way the furniture was arranged, I could always see the hallway to my parents' room and the laundry room out of the corner of my eye from the couch. It started small, just a shadow moving back and forth between the rooms, barely noticeable, but it was there, whizzing past, almost constantly. I thought I was imagining things at first, but soon my dad mentioned it too. He didn't want to frighten me, but he saw it as well. At first, it was easy to ignore, but it got to the point where I'd get so used to it that I started talking to it. I'd call it my buddy, the ghost shadow, and ask it not to scare me. I guess it didn't bother me too much at that point, even though it felt unnerving. But things didn't stay quiet for long. Months later, after my parents' divorce, I stayed in the house with my mum. One night, I was home alone, around 10 p.m., watching television, when I suddenly felt watched. It was that gut-wrenching feeling, like someone was standing right behind me. I turned to the window and saw something that made my blood freeze. A shadow, tall and thin, about 7 or 8 feet behind me in the reflection. For a split second, I stared, too terrified to move. The shadow wasn't just a trick of the light, it was a full human-shaped silhouette. I didn't move, didn't take my eyes off the television until my mum came home, and I sure as anything didn't want to see anything else. When my mum told me what happened, it was worse. One night, she was sitting on the couch, and out of nowhere, her Lady of Shalott picture, which had been sitting on the mantel, suddenly lifted into the air. For a heartbeat, it hung there, suspended, before crashing to the floor, glass shattering. When we moved out, the landlord's uncle, who had once lived there, had died in the house right near where the shadow appeared. He was known to be disgruntled towards women, and the space where the shadow moved used to be his workshop. The landlord asked my mum, "So did you see him?" It was then that I understood. We weren't just haunted by a shadow, but by something much darker.
Story 10. Shadow that crawled.
It was a cold, damp evening when my family moved into the old house on the outskirts of town. The place had been abandoned for years, but the price was right, and my parents were eager to make it home. From the moment we crossed the threshold, a heavy silence seemed to hang in the air. It felt wrong. The house was large, dark, with creaking floors and walls that seemed to whisper when the wind passed through the cracks. It started small at first, strange noises, things moving when no one was around, but it was the shadows that really began to unsettle me. I remember sitting in the living room one night watching television when I noticed a figure standing in the hallway just out of the corner of my eye. I thought it was a trick of the light, so I shrugged it off, but the figure didn't disappear. It stood there, unmoving, watching. One night, I decided to investigate. Armed with nothing but a flashlight, I ventured into the hallway where I had seen the figure. The air grew colder with every step, my breath visible in the dim light. I turned the corner, but there was nothing, no shadow, no figure. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the unease lingered. Days later, my younger brother came to me, pale and shaking. He claimed he had seen the figure in the same hallway, only it wasn't standing anymore. It was crawling toward him, its limbs twisted in unnatural angles. I didn't know what to believe anymore. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard the sound of soft footsteps in the hall. I held my breath, waiting. Then I saw it, a shadow at the foot of my bed. It was tall and elongated, its form indistinct but growing closer. I froze, unable to move, as it slowly reached for me, its cold, unseen hand brushing against my skin. And in that moment, I knew we were not alone.
Thanks for joining us on this terrifying adventure. If tonight's story gave you chills, let us know in the comments below, and share your own scary experiences too. Don't forget to leave a like if you want more nightmares, and subscribe if you haven't already. Until next time, sleep tight, and remember, not all shadows are empty.